back to the Ultimate Piano course by Joseph N. In the last video, we used the circle of fifths and our scales to help us read and play all of the notes in our major keys. However, in all of those examples, all of the notes were right next to each other. So what happens when they're spread apart? Well, let's find out, shall we? To understand how to read notes outside of a scale setting, we're going to need to understand how to measure distance on the piano. Another term for distance is an interval, and the first interval we'll discuss is called a unison. A unison is defined as two of the same note being played at the same time. And now you might be thinking, well, how can I play the same note at the exact same time as itself? And the answer is you can't. This isn't really as applicable to the piano as it is to something like a choir. For example, the sopranos, the ladies with the highest voices, could be singing the same exact note as the altos, the ladies with the lower voices, at the exact same time. So the two notes would be written to be played at the same time on top of each other. On the piano, the only instances of unisons that we'll see is notes repeating after one another. So you could see a middle C followed by another middle C, and that interval would be a unison. The second is a much more familiar interval to us because we use it all the time in scales. A second is moving from one note to the very next note, or more specifically, one letter to the very next letter. When we look at the letters on the staff, they alternate between line, space, and so on. So whenever we see a second on the staff, we always think from one line to the next space, or from one space to the next line, going up or down. We've seen plenty of examples of seconds on the piano already, so instead let's go right to our thirds. A third is defined as one note being on a line, going to the next line, or a note on a space, going to the next space. So they will always stay on whatever type of note they started on. A line will stay on a line, and a space will stay on a space. Going to the piano, all we're going to do is think of this as a skip. A C, for example, will skip over the letter D and go straight to E. An E will skip over F and go to G, and so on. So there will always be one note in between. Seconds and thirds offered nice shortcuts for us to remember these. Seconds are always moving sequentially, line to space, and thirds skip over, line to a line, or space to a space. But beginning with our fourths, we're now going to have to start counting each of the individual notes within the interval, because they're starting to become too large for these shortcuts. For a fourth, it is actually much like a second, in that it goes from a line to a space, or a space to a line. However, there's multiple notes in between those lines and spaces, so again, we have to count them out. Let's head to the piano to do so. We'll begin again with middle C, which happens to be on a line. From middle C, we're going to count up 4 notes. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and we end up on F. Note that there are 2 notes in between, and that's another way you can think about it. On the staff, it'll be C on a line, D on a space, E on a line, and then F on a space. So you can see line to space, but we're skipping notes in between. Just like our fourths used the second as another reference because they're both lines to space or space to line, the fifth is going to use the third as a reference because it too is line to line or space to space. Look at the difference between a third and a fifth though. A third is a much smaller interval. It only goes from one line to the very next line, or one space to the very next space. A fifth, however, goes from one line 2 lines up, or from one space 2 spaces up before it reaches the next interval. Heading to the piano, if we start on C, we'll count up 5 notes to get to our fifth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we'll land on a G. Remember, we're using seconds to count each of these notes up because those are from one note to the very next note. But to reach these larger intervals, all that matters is how many we have counted in total. So in this case, all 5 notes. Ever increasing in size, now we're moving on to a sixth. A sixth is again like a fourth or a second, where it's space to line or line to space. But note the size gaps between second, fourth, and sixth. Heading to the piano, we're going to count 6 notes. C is going to be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll land on A. You can also use the scale degrees, referencing the major scale itself, to find the same intervals. Moving on to our sevenths, we're now going to be reaching another instance where it is line to line or space to space, just like our fifths and our thirds. In this case, for the seventh, we're going to be increasing in size once again. Note the difference. For the third, we move from one line to the very next line. The fifth is one line, 2 lines up to the next line. And a seventh would be one line, 3 lines up to the next line. And vice versa for a space. We're going to be moving up 1 space, 2 spaces, or now 3 spaces for the seventh. Heading to the piano, we'll begin on C and count up to 7 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we'll land from C to a B. The final interval we'll discuss today is an eighth, often called an octave. You can think an octagon has 8 sides, so an octave has 8 notes. They share the same prefix. They also share the same similarities to 6/4 and seconds, in that they go from line to space, or space to line. Now, note the size differences once again. Beginning from a second, those notes are directly next to each other, from one space to the next line, or from one line to the next space. For a fourth, we go from one line 2 spaces up, or from one space 2 lines up. The sixth is one line 3 spaces up, or one space 3 lines up. And then the octave is one line 4 spaces up, or one space 4 lines up. Heading to the piano, we're going to count the 8 notes, and we'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'll end up actually on the same note. So you can think an octave is from one letter to the next instance of that exact same letter. A very good practice habit for identifying intervals is to feel the differences between them using as many fingers as you can. So for example, if I wanted to play a second, I should know what that feels like moving from my first finger to my second finger. Also, from my second finger to my third, the third to a fourth, and a fourth to a fifth. Ideally, you can do this without looking, so you can actually feel the differences between each interval. Likewise, for a third, I should really know how they feel from a first to a third finger, but also stretching from a first to a second finger. Same thing here, from a second to a fourth, or a second to a third, and so on and so forth. Test out all these intervals on your own, seeing if you can feel the differences without having to look. It'll be a very good practice method for future songs. Let's take a look now at the practice example written in the book. Let's ignore all the different types of notes for now and just simply focus on the intervals that are written there. Beginning with our first note, we have a C. The next note written directly after is also going to be a C. We know that a unison is the same note moving to another instance of that same note. So that's what's going to happen here. We have a unison. From our second middle C, we're going to move from a line to another line. Because we're not skipping any lines for these two notes, we know that the C to the next E there is going to be a third. From the E that we left off on, we're going to be moving from the bottom line of the treble clef to the second line of the treble clef. So once again, line to line, and we're not skipping over any lines. So therefore, it's just a third. And we move to G. So that first unit of notes we see goes from middle C, a unison to another middle C, a third to E, and a third to G. Let's see if we can figure out the rest of these intervals on our own. Understanding the interval technique will greatly increase your note reading speed. Instead of having to read 88 keys and translating their letters onto the piano from the music, we'll instead just read the very first letter of the piece and translate the rest using the intervals. By simplifying 88 keys into just 8 intervals, we'll be able to much more easily read all of the notes in real time. I'll demonstrate how to play the piece for you now. Again, we're going to not look at those different types of notes for now, and just focus on the intervals and the proper fingerings we're going to need to play them. From the beginning, we'll start with our thumb on middle C. Here we go. let's recap everything we've learned thus far. We began by talking about intervals, which is just a measurement of distance between two notes. A unison is the first one we talked about, which is simply two of the exact same notes played one after another. A second is when we move up or down from one line to a space, or from one space to a line, so we'll be to the very next note. A third is going to move up or down from a line to a line, or from a space to a space, so we will skip over one letter. A fourth is when we move up or down just like a second from a line to a space or a space to a line, but the gap is going to be much larger. So in this case, it's from a line 2 spaces up or down, or from a space 2 lines up or down. A fifth is similar to a third in that it's line to line or space to space, but again, the gap is 2 lines up from line to line, or 2 spaces up from space to space. A sixth is again like a fourth or a second, line to space or space to line, but we're going to move from one line 3 spaces up or down, or from one space 3 lines up or down. A seventh, just like a fifth or a third, is from line to line or space to space, but it's going to be from a line 3 lines up or down, or a space 3 spaces up or down. Finally, we learned about eighths, otherwise called octaves. An octave is going to be, again, from a line to a space, just like a sixth, fourth, or second, but it could be from a line 4 spaces up and down, or a space 4 lines up and down. Make sure to use this interval technique to help us read pieces in the future. As we learn harder and harder pieces, it becomes more and more imperative for us to quickly read these notes, and the interval technique is a very fast way to not have to read every letter involved, and simply look at the distances between them. With all that in mind, I'll see you all in the next video.